It seems that we've become so content with just scraping by, as if having just enough to meet our needs is ethical in the grand scheme of things, given our, extensive technology and resources at this point in human history. I think it's disgusting that we are still engaged in so much violence around the world. And I can't condemn it enough. I feel so repulsed, almost so much so that it's hard for me to even discuss it on YouTube, because I hate to just bring down, the frequency of my, videos in a way, because I want them to be exceptionally positive, but I realize that at the same time I can't, dismiss the importance of those topics, and I do want to draw more attention to it myself, publicly, because this is just pure insanity. And I think if you can't see that now, it's really a symbol of how ingrained that you are psychically into the current state of affairs. Around the world, as we speak, there are a surprising number of corrupt politicians, inhumane conditions, immoral and inept governments that are engaged in the murdering of their own people, the starvation of, their citizens, the repression systematically also of immigrants. In almost every country, there's a large problem like this, but some of the big ones that have to be mentioned right now are Russia, Iran, China. Those are some of that come to mind immediately. Another one that I'm not quite as familiar with, but I know a little bit about, is Congo. Of course, the Israel conflict. These are some that are just kind of, Myanmar was another one. Just kind of, in the front and center of the, news stream in the last, year or 2 years or so. You've probably heard recently about Iran, in which, something like 2,000 to 3,000 people have been murdered. And of course, that should take into account both the sides of the protesters and perhaps any officials. Because, regardless of what side you're on, if you're being killed in an act of violence, yes, it's still murder. So I think those numbers should also include the, soldiers and war casualties, etc. Regardless of their fundamental beliefs, I think it shows the extreme level of violence that's being, committed. And, in all of these cases, pretty much without failure, there is a totalitarian, regime that does not allow for dissidents. They shut protesters down. They're willing to kill protesters. Imagine that. You're willing to kill somebody that refuses to align perfectly with your belief system. I mean, that is terrifying. In 2026, that completely blows my mind. Completely. It's hard to imagine. So, stuff like that, I think it's just so um, you know, intertwined with the current, you know, level that the majority of the planet is on, that we can't still really fathom how sick and twisted that is. That as much development as we had, as much technology as we've produced, we're still so fundamentally corrupted on a power level that we're doing these things. You know, we're still engaging in mass sex trafficking around the world. We're still engaging in modern slave labor. And the list goes on. You know, there's so many atrocities that are taking place. And it's just, you know, heartbreaking to an extent, because it doesn't seem like that should still be so normalized, you know? But unfortunately, because of the nature of life, so many people have been forced to just focus on their immediate financial circumstances, their immediate, you know, survival circumstances in some cases, to just, you know, get food on the table, just to live. And if they have a family, then the ideas of politics and spirituality oftentimes are in the back seat, because those are, you know, almost exclusively reserved in many cases for the elite. And if you consider America as, you know, the leading financial entity of the world, you know, or one of them, then technically by default, you know, Americans are elites to the rest of the world in many cases. So even if you are struggling as an American, chances are you're doing better than 95% of the planet. So by that metric, you know, you are, you know, somebody that should have access to those, you know, liberties. And maybe it does come down to a choice, but either way, there's too much focus on these very low vibrational thought patterns. And, you know, ideas like sex, drugs, and money are really kind of the essence of what, you know, clouds our judgment. And I don't think religion helps. Personally, I think religion is one of the largest institutions that has organized and facilitated the deaths of countless people in human history. And they do it proudly, which is so sick. I can't even begin to describe it. So it's something that basically, it starts out, you know, I think on a very small level as pure. You know, one person thinking about an idea, oftentimes it's very raw and, you know, maybe esoteric. But once institutions become populated and become, you know, breathing organisms that function almost like humans themselves, that's when the corruption begins. And I've learned a term recently called egregore, and essentially that is what happens when a larger scale, you know, thought form kind of materializes in the real world and starts to operate like an organic body, you know? So the Islamic State, the Catholic institution, the Jewish, you know, Zionists, like these are essentially vehicles to, in many cases, very horrendous, you know, violations of human liberty and ethics, I would say. And if you look at some of the actions that have taken place in the name of these three religions, especially, it is absolutely terrifying. You know, so they will use those to defend the crimes they commit. And a lot of people, you know, that are just law-abiding and, you know, family-oriented, they won't really be able to see the kind of demarcation from, more, fundamental, pure ideologies, because all they can see is that they live in a world that is very hard, and perhaps this institution does provide some small benefit to them. And so the cost and the killing and the genocides that occur, they suck, but as long as my family's okay, then, that's really all I can think about. And I think that's the complacency that has contributed in a lot of ways to the continuation of a lot of these, activities. So, America really is no different. We also are committed in our, imperialism. It's still a very, monopoly-like structure of the world, even in 2026, where you have, Trump, trying to, for whatever reason, if it's purely egotistical, or if there's some sort of, puppeteering behind the scenes, attempting to acquire more, geopolitical advancements through his presidency that really serve no immediate, need for the American people, nor for the people that are being, perhaps displaced or affected by these campaigns. So in the cases of Venezuela and maybe even Greenland coming soon, these are really not necessary, There definitely are questions where if you have a dictator, or if you have, a leader that is, totalitarian, authoritarian, should there be outside intervention to perhaps limit, his or her control and power? Probably, but that is something that should most likely be done on the international scale. And I don't think it should take one country's decision to, make that a reality so instantaneously. So the US should not operate rogue, just like other countries should not operate rogue. So you have to condemn it across the board. You have to condemn US, you have to condemn Israel, you have to condemn Russia, and China, invading Taiwan, its, authoritarian hold over Hong Kong. And so you do have to kind of, look at these various cases and, just point out that something's not right. In 2026, something's not right. This is just overwhelmingly, concerning that so many people are still, quiet about this. And I think for me too, I have been quiet too long in the public space, not out of fear by any means, but just out of, hope that, my positivity would also inspire enough individuals. But I think activism has to be something that's, encouraged and validated moving forward, because there's no way in hell that I'm gonna sit and just say nothing. I just can't do that anymore. And I think people need to hear that, younger people are rising up and are, speaking out, are protesting, are, voting against these types of people, are condemning these, acts of violence and genocide, and most importantly, supporting other humans. Because that is the legacy that we should leave behind in these years. We don't want to leave behind a legacy of war and destruction in the 2020s, where we just sat by and spent our days on TikTok and just, indulged ourselves. That's ridiculous, especially as young people. We have no excuse with our privileged lives to be doing that. So we need to, collectively gain some momentum. We need to put our talents to good work. We need to stop investing so much time in sex, drugs, and money, and start putting our focus on more humanitarian outlets where people can gain traction supporting one another and servicing the world, which is probably what we ought to be doing anyway as humans. And that's really the essence of how I feel about this. And I'm going to try to create this as a standalone series as well, or a playlist where I can continually, portray my opinions, but also kind of, outline certain, ideas I have, steps that I would like to take, and opportunities for further activism, either politically or in my community, that I can take to, further encourage and uplift positive values. All right, so if you're watching this, stay aware, be careful. Something is not right, and use that to your benefit. Become more observant, become more careful, and still, above all, become more hopeful. We got to work towards it, though. All right.